Welcome to the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast with your host, Jim Robinson.
Hello, and welcome back to the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Robinson. Earlier this year, we had the privilege of hosting Scott Harris, brand lead for the Master's Choice brand within Rob Seco. And what we're going to do today is play an episode from Scott and I where we discuss how the hybrid selection process for the Master's Choice brand differs from that of the rest of the industry, which selects for commodity grain portfolios. Anyway, go ahead and take a listen and enjoy.
Welcome to the MC Podcast. My name is Scott Harris.
My whole life's been dairy farming. Grew up in it.
Thank you for having me on your podcast. Appreciate that very much.
It's been exciting to watch you guys work.
So I'd like to welcome Mr. Jim Robinson.
Hey, Scott. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes, sir. It is good that we don't do this by video, but I can actually see you, so it's good to see you. It's been a while.
You too.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So Jim, why don't we kind of start off and you tell us who Rob Seco is, who you are, and we'll go start there.
Absolutely. So Rob Seco is an independent seed company based out of Elkhorn, Nebraska, so the eastern part of Nebraska. We have a long history in the seed industry going back to 1888, but really this iteration of Rob Seco started in 2013, really first crop year 2014, and we focus on corn hybrids from nearly the Canadian border down to Mexico, and then with the addition of Master's Choice to the family, we extended to Canada and down to Arizona, California.
Yeah, absolutely. So in case you didn't pick up on that, in case you didn't know, Rob Seco owns Master's Choice. They own the brand and the company, and so we've been part of the Rob Seco family since about August, I guess it was, when everything kind of was finally transferred over, and so we have a mutual relationship here, obviously, and Jim is very much serving the role of helping us make sure our lineup is different and diversified, and it's a little bit different animal. Rob Seco was, I'm sure, and still is in some dairy pockets and sells some silage products, but primarily Master's Choice was brought in as a completely different line and different purpose. Is that a fair way of saying that, Jim?
That's absolutely the right thing. So yeah, where Rob Seco predominantly focuses on grain hybrids, we do have a couple of silage hybrids within the Rob Seco lineup. The Master's Choice lineup is purely focused on animal nutrition with a heavy focus on dairy.
Yep. And so kind of, one of the things that I think kind of worried maybe some of the outlets that we deal with was what that might look like for a future. But actually, as they've learned, and I've been doing calls recently with our outlets, and they all have been very appreciative of the fact that we've stuck true to that, and it looks like we will stick true to that it's going to be a different focus and kind of maintaining that livestock focus. And so a lot of value there, but let's just dive off into it. I know that, we try, Jim, we do try to keep this podcast to 20 to 30 minutes because I know you can talk corn genetics for about 17 hours probably with no break. So we're gonna limit that. But so when you're looking from your side of things, when you're looking at a hybrid for Master's Choice, what do you look for that maybe differentiates a little bit from maybe what you're looking at from the Rob Seco side of things?
Right, absolutely. So, the general purpose of the hybrids for Master's Choice differ from Rob Seco in that most of the Rob Seco hybrids are focused on grain that will be harvested by a farmer and eventually taken to an elevator. A lot of that either gets fed or shipped overseas into, shipping containers. So what you look for is Master's Choice hybrids predominantly being used for silage, the hybrid that has excellent digestibility for the animal, with great nutritional characteristics. Tonnage does matter. It's not the primary focus, but it is a component of the focus. Whereas for Rob Seco, we're looking for hybrids that'll stand late into the season, dry down in the field, have higher test weight, and will be suitable for storage in a bin and eventually sale to a ethanol plant, shipping company, whatever it might be.
Right. Right, and so in that, typically you're going to generally see, not necessarily a hard and fast rule, but you're going to generally see a lower test weight in a lot of your Master's Choice type hybrids. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair assessment. Yeah, because a big part of the nutritional quality and energy that comes from the plants, it comes from the grain itself. And so if the grain's too hard, too dense, it will pass right through the animal, as opposed to something that we're looking for with the Master's Choice lineup is that we don't want anything going out the back end of the animal if we can avoid it. And so a softer, less dense starch will typically do that for us.
Absolutely. And that's where it's been it's a bit of a challenge for us in the aspect of trying to compete, because I think that sometimes there's a natural assumption by a dairy farmer, or I should say by a farmer, that yield is all that matters. And while you don't want to take a backseat to yield, we have to look at more than that, particularly from a nutrition side of things.
Mm-hmm. It's actually just a different type of yield. So you're looking for the Master's Choice lineup
That's a good point.
The milk that you can produce, and so that's the yield that we want to maximize, not necessarily the bushels per acre.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And we even want to dive off into specifically, we're looking at yield from a component standpoint as well. So really at the end of the day, we have to understand and get farmers to understand that not all starch is created equal. Mm-hmm. Not all starch ends up serving the same purpose. Some of it, doesn't actually get utilized, and so that's what we got to make sure we're getting the stuff that actually gets utilized by the animal. If you're taking that all the way to dry grain and you're not feeding it, it doesn't matter. And so just kind of identifying those differences. So
yeah. So actually, if I could expand on that, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you look at what occurs in the industry because of the downstream aspects, and the primary people purchasing grain in the industry are generally the ones that dictate the direction that the industry goes. And so if you think about what grain buyers want, they want grain that will store well in a bin, so less damage, that it moves from the combine into the grain cart, from the grain cart into the bin, from the bin into the truck, from the truck into the elevator, and from the elevator to the train, to the shipping container, then overseas or wherever else it may go. And so a harder, denser grain, you can fit more of it into a single container. But not only that, you also tend to get less damage with a harder, denser grain than you do with a softer type of starch that's more likely to fracture as each of those transfers occur. And so while it's not as good for the animal, it is better for the grain trading industry to have a harder, denser grain that ships better and transfers better.
Absolutely. Yep. Go ahead.
Oh, and that's not necessarily an easy characteristics to breed for. I mean, I have an education in genetics and everything, and grain characteristics are quantitative traits, so they're not necessarily things that you can easily select for. It takes a lot of different genes contributing into the characteristics of those kernels of the starch itself, and so you tend to, over time, get a bias in the industry toward one type of grain versus another.
Right, and so that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the industry as a whole going kind of one direction, and we're trying to identify something almost in a completely opposite direction that we want to utilize for the Master's Choice lineup. And so there's some challenges that come with that, though, right? Because you're kind of hitting on it, so let's just kind of dive off into that a little bit more. What are some of the challenges from your standpoint when you're trying to look at you're looking kind of two different directions, but one of the biggest factors has to be cost.
For sure. So, the cost of finding, developing, commercializing Master's Choice hybrids is, while we work with a lot of different originators, so breeders, licensing groups, whatever they may be, you have to sift through a lot of material to find what exactly works for the Master's Choice lineup, because they're selecting for things that work more broadly for their customer base, and we are selecting for things that work for our customer base, which may differ. So there's a significant cost in the trialing, testing, evaluating, and eventually commercialization of these products. And so, we may not necessarily find things from one licensing group, but we still have to check, because eventually we may find something there, and another breeding program will be pretty prolific in the Master's Choice lineup. And it's just a cost of doing business to find those right hybrids.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, and the hard part is, and this is what, I say this across the country when I go to meetings, is yield and agronomy is going to be the first lens that you're going to look through. I don't care which direction you're going with it. When you're talking about if you're going to take it the Master's Choice direction, or it's a better fit for grain side, Rob Seco side, whatever it may be, it still has to be able to yield. It has to be able to handle agronomic pressures. Because even on the livestock side, even on the nutrition side, it doesn't do any good if you have an amazing feeding product, but you don't have any of it. You know, if you can't yield any of it, that's not going to do you any good. And also part of that is the cost side, because you do add layers of testing when you're talking about silage hybrids as far as, you know, sampling. You know, if you were to have a very large plot, you're talking $35 minimum per sample to do just a standard test that you wouldn't have to do on the grain side.
Right.
And so there's just a lot of additional costs there.
Oh, for sure. And you know, doing those tests, you know, it's critical to commercializing the products. But, you know, as you said, agronomically, you know, you have to test across a broad geography in order to understand a hybrid's true performance or what it may or may not be susceptible to. Because like you said, you know, if you don't have anything to actually feed, you know, through the animal, then it just doesn't work no matter how digestible it might be. And so disease tolerance is a big portion of that. You know, we have plenty of hybrids we've evaluated that have fantastic digestibility, but they die too early. And so you just don't get enough of it.
Yeah, because that's the other side of this too, is that even from a silage side of things, you have, I mean, obviously we said it doesn't have to stand as long as a grain hybrid, typically speaking, but you also particularly don't want something that's going, or at least you need to be able to know that it dries down very fast, because moisture is the biggest factor in the quality of a hybrid. I don't care how good it is. If you let it get too dry, you've cost yourself a lot of money and a lot of energy. And so understand, you know, evaluating all that. I mean, that's just, every time there's just an added layer. You're adding time, you're adding cost, and it's just a big factor. And so to take on this concept of identifying something very special and different isn't just words. There's a lot of action, money that goes into it that you're having to put behind it.
Oh, for sure. For sure. There are plenty of things we would love to commercialize, but they just don't quite fit. And so
exactly.
Yep.
So that's a great segue into why don't they fit, because the question is, how difficult is it, and I don't know that you need to put a scale on this, but how difficult is it right now, given that the industry is mainly going in a different direction? How difficult is it to identify those hybrids right now for a Master's Choice lineup?
Yeah, I mean, let me use an example within the Rob Seco lineup of a hybrid that if you looked at the hybrid, you'd think this would be a great Master's Choice hybrid. This should go in the Master's Choice lineup, but ultimately it shouldn't once you look a little bit deeper. So Rob Seco has a hybrid that we use for grain that we call RC5323. It's a fantastic hybrid. It has plenty of grain yield, a ton of grain yield, and it stands really well. It has really high test weight. But as soon as you chop it and start evaluating the quality of the silage that comes off of that hybrid, you find that it's not very digestible. Part of that's the hybrid stands so well that it's just so lignified. It's not, absolutely, it's not digestible. And the high test weight of the grain itself doesn't make it break down very well within the animal. It's really high test weight, harder grain type of a hybrid. And so it just ultimately becomes a below average silage product. And so, you know, while it'll have a ton of tonnage, it's not going to necessarily result in a lot of milk production. And so that's the challenge when you walk through small plot trials and you're evaluating brand new crosses to, you know, something that looks good in the field isn't necessarily going to be the product that fits in the portfolio.
Absolutely, because you're looking at, you know, starch digestibility, fiber digestibility. You're looking at flex hybrids. That's a major concept for Master's Choice, is a little more flex, a little slightly lower population, kind of giving the plant the ability to kind of naturally do what it wants to do, and just total plant energy from top to bottom. And so that's a lot of stuff that you're having to look at and consider. And when you have an industry that overall is typically tending to go the other way, that adds another layer of difficulty to the whole process for us.
Oh, for sure. And if I could expand on that ear flex component, I mean, that's a big deal. It's not just ear flex, it's total plant flex.
Right.
It's, how we want to define it. So, as you go lower in population, the plants compensate having more space to draw in sunlight, and you get a larger ear, more grain per ear, but also you get a larger rind on the plant itself too. So there's fewer lignin or less lignin to have to pass through the animal. But you look at the industry, and in the early 1970s, there's a real inflection point on yield across the United States, so yield per acre. And that's about when B73 Missouri 17 was commercialized. And the big deal about that hybrid that made it so successful within the industry was the fact that it had a really vertical canopy and tolerated a higher plant population. So people started pushing populations little by little and going from 14 to 18,000 plants per acre all the way up to where we are today, with some parts of the country planting over 40,000 plants per acre. And so you lose a lot of flex germplasm over that 40, 50-year period. And we still have to spend a lot of effort to find those hybrids that will flex not only in the ear, but in the plant as well.
Right. Yeah, because that is a big factor, particularly I think in the dairy side of things, they tend to are willing, or I should say they're more willing to plant at a lower population. And if you can get them to understand that concept, it makes a big difference. But but the expression of that has been visual primarily up until a few years ago when Master's Choice did a population study, and we actually looked at the sweet spot. What is kind of the sweet spot of, okay, maximizing my yield by having more plants out there, but at what point do I break that off to where I'm actually losing a lot more nutrition, fiber side, starch side, both aspects, to where it wouldn't have mattered if I yielded more. I actually didn't yield more at the end of the day as far as nutrients go. And so, we're getting there, and we've identified. I mean, I think we've got a pretty good feel for that. But the more we can continue to develop that and identify that, the better that's going to be for all of us, for sure, without a doubt. So I think we've kind of hit on a lot of this, but why is it important for independent companies like Rob Seco to kind of keep diversity in the portfolio? Why does that matter? To the farm, to the industry, why is it important?
Yeah, it's really important because, as you look at what has happened to corn hybrids over the years, we've already talked about the higher test weight, the better standability for grain hybrids, meaning higher lignin content and less digestible plant material. But also, you start to see the exact same plant styles, the exact same grain types out of every hybrid in the industry, and that's just not good overall for different end market uses of corn. I mean, corn is used for all sorts of things, anywhere from food grade corn that's made into tortillas, chips, whatever else might be, to ethanol production, to grain for feed, to silage for dairies, and as well as beef, which are actually two different silage targets on each of those. So, as the germplasm converges in terms of what it does in the industry, you lose the ability to maximize the use of that feed, in the animal. So it takes more feed to result in the same amount of milk, or more feed to result in the same amount of beef produced. And that's why we need to continue maintaining diversity in the industry.
Yeah, and especially particularly as an independent company, it's important that we have a little more control over our futures than what we would be kind of limited to in the industry. So I think it's an important factor to bring that out too. So as far as when you are kind of going through the process, what is kind of the last thing to kind of wrap it up from a genetic side of things is trying to figure out how to word this. So if you were going to really deep dive into how long it takes a hybrid to get developed, is there any difference in things as far as when you're going one direction versus the other, or what's the overall standard? I think that maybe a lot of people don't realize the amount of time it takes to get something into market.
Yeah, so I mean, that just to kind of hit it right off the bat, the hybrids and inbreds we're advancing into our portfolios right now are the result of initial crosses made back in 2012, 2013. And so it has been 8 years in development and trialing and stage advancements that takes you from starting the process of creating a new inbred to commercializing a new hybrid with those things. So there's a lot of time, energy, talent, trialing, really environments that go into developing these new inbreds and new hybrids. And so we are looking through everything over a period of several years. There are some lines that we've looked at for several years that finally find the right partner to make a commercial hybrid. There may be aspects we really, really like about it, but it needs a new male inbred to bring along other characteristics to make it commercially viable. And so the time and effort that goes into trialing, evaluating, and ultimately seeing where a product fits within the portfolio, that's what the majority of my time and the product team here at Seco, what our time is spent doing. And that's ultimately what will deliver a commercial portfolio in the future.
Yeah, I think that it's just not probably generally, and I don't mean this as a bad thing to any farmers listening, but I don't think it's probably appreciated how long that process and difficult that process is. And there's a lot you can I would assume, not a plant geneticist by any means, but I would assume you can put a fair amount of trust in the family line, but at the end of the day, you really don't know how the crosses are going to turn out. You have to go see them. You have to look at the data. You've got to get out there and see what's going on. You can't just go by just that factor alone.
Exactly. I mean, even with today's machine learning algorithms, with the ability to sequence the genomes of each individual inbred, there's still so much diversity within the corn genome that we just can't know all of the interactions between those genes and the environments that they work in, and the heterosis that occurs when crossing one inbred to another inbred to get a hybrid out of the two. So you've got to get your eyes on it in the field. You've got to take yields out. You've got to chop. You've got to measure quality. All those things go into ultimately advancing hybrids.
Yeah, and you've got to try it in a bunch of different parts of the country as well.
Yes.
Because it's going to act a lot different in eastern Pennsylvania than it's going to act in central Wisconsin, right? There's a good chance that it will anyway.
For sure. Yeah.
So,
not very many hybrids can move from Ohio to Colorado.
Yeah. And so then with all of that and thinking about building two lineups, then along with your other responsibilities, I guess the big question is, when do you sleep, Jim?
I don't have very many hobbies.
This is your hobby, right?
This is my hobby.
Well, I do want to thank you for joining, Jim. Any other final thoughts for us before I kind of close things out that we didn't hit on that you think's important?
No, I think as we get into later in January and in February, we'll be announcing new advancements into the portfolio and what the portfolio will look like in the future. So make sure you stay tuned and look forward to what all comes through. I hope you enjoyed that episode, and thank you to the Master's Choice team for having me on to talk about how hybrid selection differs for the Master's Choice lineup compared to Seco and most of the rest of the industry. Selecting specifically for silage-specific hybrids that have high feed value and maximize the output of your animal is really what the Master's Choice lineup is all about. As always, be sure to tune in on the 1st and 15th of every month for new episodes, and until then, stay field ready.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Seco Field Ready Podcast. Join us next time to be Field Ready.
A Hurrdat Media Production.